Refresh.
We have another 1 minute. Please start after 10 seconds.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, all our participants who are joining us, representing different part of the world. As well as I would like to welcome all of you in a traditional Sri Lankan way. It's called Aibowan. It has a meaning, may you oil life your life longer. So that's the Sri Lankan traditional welcome with a meaning, especially during this type of pandemic situation. The meaning of the greeting as well as the way we are welcoming. So it's really important keeping the social distance. So today we are going to talk about aligning economics to sustainability, waste management, and the environment. So it's really important theme during this time. So powered by Association for Environment Management and Sustainability. So this is one of our main event which are going to organize, especially not only for the members, to all other participants who are joining from different part of the world. Actually, we had registration around more than 250 participants represented 35 countries. I hope they will join us during this session. Then I'd like to remind about our lineup few conferences which are related to this topic as well as related to this association. 4th International Conference on Economics and Development 2020. 3rd and 4th December, we are going to do its online conference actually. Then 5th International Conference on Climate Change 2021. It will be held on 18th and 19th on February 2021, as well as the 2nd World Conference on Waste Management 2021. It will be held on 4th and 5th March on 2021. As well as I'd like to mention about sustainable practices as our partner. So I hope when talk about these 3 conferences as well as our associations, then we thought like-minded people will join with us for this session. Then as I mentioned earlier, to talk about aligning economics to sustainability, waste management, and the environment. Today we have very key person to talk about this area, none other than Dr. Madhavi Venkatasan. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Madhavi Venkatasan by saying Aibowan, Doctor. So I just brief about herself to get to know all others. Dr. Madhavi Venkatasan earned her PhD, MA, and BA in economics from Vanderbilt University. She is presently a full-time faculty member in the economics department at Northeastern University and teach the environmental economics and markets course at Vermont Law School. She has written and lectured internationally on the topic sustainability specific to economics and was the Fulbright distinguished lecturer to the Philippines in 2017. And she has written 3 introductory economics textbooks under the series A Framework for Sustainable Practices, and in August 2019, her 4th book, Sustainable Economic Growth and Decent Work for All, was published. Then Madhavi is presently under contract with Routledge to write SDG 12, Responsible Consumption and Production, and her text, Economic of Sustainability, is scheduled to be published by Springer in late 2020, very soon. In 2016, Dr. Madhavi established Sustainable Practices, a 501c3 nonprofit with a mission to facilitate a culture of sustainability as defined by reducing the human-made impact to the planet and its ecosystems within Constable country. So much to, and is the organization's executive director. In 2019, Sustainable Practices initiated the municipal plastic bottle ban campaign. So by November 18 and 2019, 11 towns of the 15 that comprise Barnstable country, Cape Cod, adopted the municipal plastic bottle ban. As of spring 2020, Sustainable Practices filled the municipal plastic bottle ban in the remaining 4 towns and initiated the commercial single-use plastic water bottle ban campaign in the 11 towns that successfully adopted the municipal plastic bottle ban. To learn more about sustainable practices, so definitely you may able to get this opportunity, as well as we discussed with her. So she is going to talk about a lot of things, as well as a lot of information you may able to get through this session. And if you have any question or any doubt, you can put it to the chat box. So after her presentation, so we will have a separate session for the Q&A. While she is presenting, if you need anything to clarify, so put it to the chat box, or not, if you can put it to the Q&A box, you can have a look about if you are looking through the laptop, it's bottom of the screen, there will be a Q&A box. Then it will be easy for us to go through that. If you put it to the Q&A box, then I'll not get that much time. So Dr. Madhavi, so again, welcome to this session. So now over to you.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with all of you today. I'd like to keep this somewhat informal, given that we have so many different people from different countries represented on our Zoom today. So please do ask any questions as we go forward. I'm going to give you just a general overview with regard to how I'm approaching the concept of economic sustainability specific to waste and environmental issues, or waste and environmental management. So right now I'm going to share my screen. So please bear with me 1 second. So this is a brief outline. What I'd like to just have for our conversation today is, first of all, how does our economic system affect culture? And this is more of a background. I'm sure that many of you are very well aware of how economics indirectly affects the aspects of externalities that we face, which are specifically found in waste and environmental degradation. But I'd really like to expand on the idea of the cultural orientation of a GDP system and give some room for thought here, because fundamentally, as we know from looking at any of the sustainability literature, we need to change our economic system in order for sustainability to actually come into being. But in order to do this, the question is, what are the levers? And ideally, there are multiple levers. So hopefully during our conversation, we'll be able to talk about that. I specifically want to highlight why certain entities are much more successful about promoting change than others. And those specific entities are businesses. They know exactly how to align their desired goal to all the different types of consumers that they are going to try to get to buy their product. When it comes to changing public opinion, in many ways, academics and those of us in the NGO or even in the nonprofit sector really focus only on one singular channel of communication, or only focus on one aspect of what we want changed, and we fail to align individuals' interests with the overall arching goal that we have in our mind. So hopefully we'll be able to talk a little bit about stakeholder engagement as really the nexus, or the activation point of creating the type of change that we want, where we would actually have lower waste and eliminate potentially environmental degradation going forward. So there's a couple other things I'll discuss in terms of what is the definition of sustainability and what is sustainable economic growth. The thing that's interesting here is there really is no standardization with regard to either one of these concepts, which primarily may be the reason for the difficulty in attaining both. So before I get started, I just want to make sure I also share with you, I'm an economist. So how I'm going to look at this is from the economic perspective. Fortunate for me, I believe the economic perspective is primarily the conduit for why we have the environmental degradation and waste issues that we have today. Primarily, these would be considered externalities or market failures. Our traditional GDP mechanism does not count for those unless they have a market value. And cleanup of waste and cleanup of environmental degradation unfortunately does. So it often leads to a perversion in the sense of instead of allocating to eliminate these issues up front, we benefit from this indicator's, the way this indicator is calculated by having market values attributed to them after the fact. So let's start with what is economic growth, externalized costs. So the externalized costs, obviously, given our topic today, are going to be waste and environmental degradation. And I'm going to pick on one particular product as we get through the discussion to focus on one aspect of what I do in my nonprofit. But just to give just a simple backdrop, you know, in economics, we talk about what's called a production possibility frontier. So this is essentially how all economies unfortunately operate, because the GDP economic indicator is one that has been exported everywhere. The goal is to maximize production based on resource use. And we look only, unfortunately, at the market value to the extent that pollution, waste, degradation are not internalized because we don't take into consideration the impact of any of those elements on future periods. We actually exacerbate the issues of lack of sustainability, and we overconsume, which is another big issue related to how our culture, our consumption culture, has affected individuals. So if you wouldn't mind my just pointing this out, the fact that we have become immediate gratification oriented with regard to consumption also is part of how we look at change itself. We look at change as being something that has to happen immediately based on efforts we put forth now. Otherwise, we walk away from it. So this immediate gratification culture is not just about goods and services. It's really how we perceive life itself in many, many ways. And that's a barrier to the changes that we need to make. So some of you already are very familiar with this. Forgive me if I'm just repeating, but it's, I think, quite important to bring this up. So in the 1940s, when GDP becomes the economic indicator on a global scale, the focus then becomes for those countries that actually have open markets or trade on consumption. Consumption from the majority of countries does drive GDP growth. Now, the problem is that not all countries have the same cultural predisposition to a GDP indicator. So countries that have larger components of unpaid work, unfortunately, look as though they're lower on the stack of GDP than they should be, because that unpaid work, given that it has no market value, underrepresents the productivity of the labor force. So that's a really important point to bring up because it's an unfair aspect, and it's also a cultural orientation of GDP that often is neglected in our discussions. So the cultural orientation of GDP fundamentally is that individuals look for gratification, high return, look for the lowest prices, and look to get the most that they can have. They don't concern themselves typically, especially if they have an active market, with the degradation that their consumption creates, because there's a market veil that preempts their ability to see it. So in developed countries specifically, this is the issue. The consumer fundamentally has a direct responsibility to all these adverse conditions, but the consumer cannot see it because of the fact that the storefront does not allow that transparency. So when we're looking at economic growth itself, and I'm just going back to the origins of this concept of waste and environmental degradation, economic growth requires production, and production requires energy. And if we look at two aspects of energy production, one is the amount of carbon dioxide that has been emitted, and GDP growth, we can see that there is a very similar trajectory in those graphics. But the issue is not just the trajectory of those graphics, but which countries benefited the most from those graphics or those emissions of greenhouse gases. And the United States fundamentally is the one country that has been affected the most in terms of the benefits accrued from greenhouse gas emissions due to production, with 27% cumulative impact on atmospheric carbon dioxide over the period 1875 to 2011. The next highest is the European Union, and that's comprised of 28 countries. This data comes from BP and is as recent as last year. It was published in 2014. So the question we have to ask ourselves when we step back is, when we look at waste and we look at environmental degradation, we have to think about the common but differentiated responsibilities from my perspective, which is the same language that we see in the Paris Agreement. And in doing this, that means that some of this change in consumption and the transparency that we have with consumption has to be done in the developed countries themselves. Because in many, many ways, those consumption habits have become integrated into culture. So there is no direct relationship between the consumption gratification and the waste and degradation done elsewhere. So those are one component of the discussion that I'm hoping that we will continue to have. The other part is defining sustainability itself. So what is sustainability? The issue fundamentally in looking at what is sustainability is the definition. So with the GDP metric, we know what the GDP metric is comprised of. It's easy to understand, formulate, and have an economy focused on it because it has a standardized definition. When it comes to sustainability, there is no standardized definition, and the one that we currently use comes out of the Brundtland Commission report. And that's basically this phrase right here, which I'll be popping up again in a second, which is that we're looking at the present as well as the future and not overusing resources in the present to preclude use in the future. That's, you know, that's interesting to me because being as old as I am, I remember 30 years ago when I was going to my undergraduate school program, and that was also embedded in the definition of economics, that economics was related to intertemporal resource use. That has changed in the last 20 years, and that may be responsible for why the gratification and the veil related to waste and environmental degradation has become that much more opaque. So, as you know, many of you know, through the United Nations, there has been certain communications related to the relationship between economics and the environment, and this, again, comes out of the Brundtland Commission report. And I always find this a very interesting quote because to me it seems like it should have always been the case. After all, economics is a discipline of evaluating resource allocation to some extent, but it also points to the underlying truth that there is no even standard definition of economics. But this right here is we can no longer talk of the economics and the environmental policy in separate compartments. So when we talk about sustainability, we must incorporate economics and the environment, and we also need to embrace the cultural orientation that economics has imposed on our perception of the environment and our perception of the responsibility for waste. So what is sustainable economic growth? And I'm going through these slides fairly quickly because I'm really looking forward to hopefully having more discussion. Sustainable economic growth, we've all looked at this, I'm sure, for a variety of reasons. As was mentioned earlier, I have a book on decent work and economic growth, and I will be completing a book for Rutledge on responsible consumption and production, which is principally one of the aspects of our discussion today, as is decent work and economic growth, because they're both paralleling waste and environmental degradation. But the issue here with the Sustainable Development Goals, which is sort of interesting to me, is on one hand, the Sustainable Development Goals is asking us to take on a different paradigm, to look at the world through a lens where morality has a greater focal area than it currently has. Arguably today, our economic system is what we would call amoral. There is no necessarily moral component in supply and demand. It's more of an optimization that through its optimization eliminates that morality, because morality is almost a cost in the system. It would be a mechanism of internalizing externalities like we currently have today. So the thing that's interesting about looking at the Sustainable Development Goals is that they do embed the macro elements of economic assessment, unemployment, GDP, interest rates. These types of elements figure very strongly in looking at these different aspects. But the other part that I'm hoping that people will start to pay attention to as well is that the Sustainable Development Goals really do not leave a whole lot of room on an overt level for cultural differences. Very much like the GDP value itself, it allows for cultural convergence. Because we are measuring the same things across different countries, we are actually imposing a certain framework through that very measurement. So I hope that that will be something that we can discuss a little bit as well. Now, specific to waste and talking about waste creation from this big picture perspective that we've just started on here. In our economic system, as we've discussed, externalities are not really a part of that system. So in looking at this graphic, what we look at are just the elements on the graphic that actually have market value. We don't consider our relationship with ecosystems, the importance of biodiversity, the fact that there is intrinsic value in other life. We have really adopted one centric perspective, and that's been forced on us by a GDP value that's used universally, to see the world through the perspective of only human centricity or anthropocentric perspectives. So from that perspective, we only look at what has value to us and neglect the others, calling them externalities or not even addressing them at all. In many, many ways, that is one of the primary reasons why we have waste accumulation and environmental degradation, but also a lack of sustainable resource utilization. And so when we think about our system, primarily right now it operates across the globe as a cradle to grave system, because we are looking to grow our economies over time. We are looking to produce more, to promote consumption. So convenience-based consumption, those items that actually only last for a few moments, like a plastic water bottle, become elements of growth, because we do not take into consideration the waste component, where they get disposed of, what happens to them at that point. And we also plan for obsolescence, and obviously convenience-based consumption items are perfect for planned obsolescence because they last only a few minutes. Additionally, with regard to waste elimination, we've been marketed to believe that recycling will work. And when we're talking specifically about plastics, recycling is a post-production creation, post-consumer responsibility. And instead of looking at the product itself and the adverse and detrimental impacts of this product over the last 40 years of its push out on a global scale, we look at the salve of trying to get people to perceive something as having an opportunity to come back cradle to cradle when it really can't. So marketing has played a tremendous role in maintaining the cradle to grave system. Profit maximization also underlies all of this, because as long as we operate in a GDP framework where the theory of the firm says that the fiduciary responsibility is ultimately to maximize profit, cost minimization will also be a focal area, which means wherever regulation allows for the externalization of cost will occur. Cradle to cradle does not really exist that much in this world. There are very, very few products, if any, in all honesty, that are cradle to cradle. And the main reason I would argue that that's the case is because we don't have a cultural affinity with the idea of cradle to cradle, or a cultural affinity with regard to zero waste. In thinking cradle to cradle at the point of production, you could actually eliminate disposal issues from the very beginning of a product's creation. You could also incorporate holistic pricing, which means that the prices will incorporate the costs of the waste, the environmental degradation, or any kind of species or ecosystem loss from the very beginning. The use life of that product would also, unlike planned obsolescence, would be much longer. It would also promote zero waste. But ultimately, cradle to cradle to succeed would have to have a paradigm shift. In other words, it should have a shift in our cultural orientation with consumption itself. So from this perspective, what I'd like to share is we have an indicator, an economic indicator, which has been imposed on a global scale, which has led to a cultural shift in the sense of how we look at our environment and we look at waste. Fundamentally, it has allowed for environmental degradation and waste by only looking at market values and a human-centric perspective on how we value and evaluate progress. But now that we're starting to understand the relationship that we have with our environment, we actually, in changing that perception, can create a cultural shift in how we consume that would fundamentally be one channel that could actually change how we look at economic systems. And it could potentially foster a new economic system. So I want to share two more things here. The reason why we're production oriented is because on some level, shape, or form, the idea exists that happiness is synonymous or consistent with having more goods. If happiness is consistent with having a sustainable way of life in the sense that we actually enjoy our interactions with other people, enjoy the environment we live, as opposed to the goods that we have being the proxy for our happiness, perhaps both we can attain that happiness, but we'd also promote the paradigm shift. So there are a couple elements here to think about. It's the proxy of what we've been bought into to teach us what makes us happy, or what makes us successful, or what our purpose is, and the actual contemplation of that on a more philosophical component as to what makes us happy and what we need. That would also drive this change, this cradle to cradle process. So I guess what I'm trying to really say is, unfortunately, we spend a lot of time looking at things from a disciplinary focus that is devoid of the human component. And I'm hoping that when we start to think about economic systems, sustainability, and the externalities that come out of this, which are waste and environmental degradation, we will invite ourselves to have a multi-channel conversation, because the change will have to occur from multiple dimensions. One, how we look at what makes us feel fulfilled, how we produce in order to promote that new type of fulfillment, and a recognition that the human system is dependent upon the environmental system and not the other way around. So in terms of the role of sustainability, I've already mentioned this to you. I'm just going to say it again. It's the development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Some aspects of GDP growth have basically taken this to mean that we need more technological progress, and that technology will be able to allow us to have more resources for the future in spite of our continued consumption and gratification needs based on the current cultural models. I hope that we will discuss this, because I don't believe that that's true. From this, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and ask if there are maybe potential for us to have a discussion. And I guess I can look into the Q&A myself and see where we can start. I'm going to read the question from Zanibi. Managing waste varies from country to country, especially in developing countries. It's a big problem and needs huge investment to change to usable energy. How to make this change in a simple way? This is a really interesting and difficult question. The number one answer is, first of all, we need to, on two levels, you need to take care of the waste that already exists in terms of what type of waste it is. And I can speak easily with regard to plastic waste, but other types of waste also exist, of course, like construction waste and other infrastructure waste. So I would really like to understand if you have an opportunity to elaborate what waste you're talking about. So obviously you need some sort of infrastructure assistance in order to eliminate that waste, to break it down into its constituent parts where it can be. But at the same time as we're eliminating the existing problems, we have to set up a new consumption infrastructure that does not allow that type of waste to continue to build. So in developing countries, unfortunately, what model has been put in place, which, in my opinion, is extremely unfortunate, is instead of giving developing countries an opportunity to be waste free from the get-go of their development, we are enabling them to be the garbage collectors of developed countries. So in certain ways, what I would suggest is a regulatory approach. So definitely the government needs to be involved to assist in terms of the types of waste that are being created to protect its people. So you need that definitely. You need monies that come from outside. I believe that common but differentiated responsibilities approach should be used to force funding from countries that actually have exacerbated or promoted that type of infrastructure waste that exists. And then at the exact same time, an educational program going on within the country about how we can be responsible for our waste and the importance of waste reduction and environmental protection. That would be my take on that and what I would suggest. It has to be a multi-pronged approach. Right now, unfortunately, if we focus on one or another, we don't focus on all at the same time. I see from Shepard, there's a comment, and he said that I would suggest internalized corporate citizenship as a way forward to achieve cradle to cradle, where it becomes a personal responsibility to take care of the environment. I'm going to just make one comment here. And I'm hoping this will be of interest to some of you. So corporations typically respond to shareholders. So there are two elements that come up quite often. One is this idea of divestiture. And that's one way of getting a company to supposedly become more sustainable. Divestiture does not work. Divestiture basically eliminates the vote from the individual that owns that share to someone who may not have that same sensitivity. And there's no historical record in terms of research that shows that divestiture has been the tipping point for companies' orientation towards a certain type of behavior. What is much more successful, and it's slowly being attempted, is activism, shareholder activism. So shareholders coming together essentially and going to the annual meeting of shareholders and demanding that fiduciary responsibility on the part of the company incorporate sustainability parameters. On top of that, promoting the idea that in the compensation scheme that that corporations pay their officers, their management team based on sustainability targets. So that's one aspect of it. But just going back to a corporation just on its own adopting sustainability, there are some that can because they are leaders in their sector. But for those that are in sectors that are highly competitive, it's very difficult for that to happen. And we see certain types of economic sectors where the waste and the supply chain and procurement management is relatively poor when it comes to looking out for citizens' rights as well as environmental protection. And that to me is a sign that we need consumers to actually be the impetus for that change. And that's a learning curve for many consumers. So I'm just going to elaborate just slightly because as was mentioned, I have a nonprofit. I believe that grassroots movements are one of the primary conduits in order to be able to promote that kind of change on a corporate level, because grassroots movements coalesce people who have similar perceptions but are consumers. So therefore they can, by stopping the purchase of certain goods and services, or by the imposition of their power of marketing, promote the desired change on a corporation. So right now, as was mentioned earlier, my nonprofit has been focused on a geographic area. We're basically an island in the elimination of single-use plastic water bottles. We've passed it now in 4 towns in the last week. We have another 11 to go, which we will be getting to between the next few months, and eliminating it completely on this island. If we eliminate it, that would be a tremendous signal, because now all of a sudden 50% of the beverage market is made up of single-use plastic water bottles. That would be eliminated. That is a grassroots movement that will be a catalyst to corporate behavior. So that's one way to look at it. So I'm going to go to another question or statement. This question comes from the perspective of how to reduce inequalities, which is a little bit different from waste or environment, but I will just point this out to you. One of the biggest issues with regard to developing countries today is related to countries looking at GDP growth and looking at their own people as a comparative advantage in terms of the labor market. So they're trading off labor as a commodity for growth, on a macro level. And that's where I think we can all benefit from starting to think about what macroeconomic economics in terms of growth means to all of us. Does macroeconomic growth refer to something that pulls everyone up in a society, or does macroeconomic growth unfortunately yield to a culture of consumption or a cultural orientation towards how we behave in a society, but not necessarily equally distribute value to everyone in a society? So that specific comment or question related to how do we tackle the issues related to income distribution or polarization of income within developing countries. I think a lot of that has to come from the regulatory perspective, the government itself. So that's where I would suggest more topics or discussion be put in place, because the government is there to be the infrastructure that protects the public welfare. But when it only protects specific interests or is only focused on macro values, perhaps it loses sight of the protection of its own people. So that would be the comment I would share with you there. Let me see if I can find any other questions here. This one is related to recycling or upcycling of textiles. Does it have any side effects? First of all, when we think about recycling of or upcycling of textiles, the question is related also to what types of markets is it displacing? That's one. Number two, it's also related to the quality of the product that comes out in its use and what it's being used for. So we have to look at things holistically. So I'll go back to one simple example that I think is much more tangible to everyone, and that would be plastic. So majority of single-use plastic is downcycled. That means that it enters our economic system as a new good, typically another good that's going to be used for a short period of time, but often is not recycled again. So looking at just recycling or upcycling or the movement of a good into another use is not sufficient. That could just be waste diversion. So in other words, you basically are moving that to another product that will eventually be wasted, not a cradle to cradle system. And in moving that product to another use that will eventually be wasted, you're allowing for more of that product to be created on the other side. So these are issues that I think oftentimes we neglect, and waste diversion is an important concept to bring up and to address. This is a really excellent question from Thelini. It's related to quantification of the environmental degradation in national accounts. I believe the first thing a developing country needs to do is perhaps reassess its cultural orientation towards the environment, its cultural orientation towards unpaid work, the idea that there may be subsistence economies already in existence, and it needs to pick and choose how it's going to evaluate the welfare of its own country, which I don't think that many countries are doing. Unfortunately, they're following a set-aside framework that has been established by the developed world, which may work for it for a variety of reasons, including colonial roots, that may not be necessarily appropriate for a developed country. And also it yields to comparison, or developing country, excuse me, it yields to comparisons to developed countries. So I would say, yes, definitely environmental degradation should be incorporated within the national accounts. But on top of that, the attribution of why that degradation has occurred. Has it occurred because of export-oriented growth? Or has it occurred because of domestic growth? And I would assume in most cases it's going to be export-oriented growth. So the cost to benefit of that export-oriented growth also should be assessed. There is a lot to be said for localized economies that are strong, efficient, and can operate on their own. It actually leads to sustainability by using the resources that we have available to us, as opposed to expanding our reach and not understanding the degradation that we cause by taking resources away from another location. So if we look back to the historical roots of economics itself, a lot of the discussions were about localized economies, because localized economies promote self-governance, interrelationship between entities that are in that economic system, and understanding of the protection of the global commons that economy operates in. There's a question here about what do you think about the level of current regulation and marketing strategy about microplastics and tracking their additives in the environment? Obviously, it's important to know what the impacts are, but I would say the first thing and most important thing would be to educate people for elimination of their use, of the elimination of the use of plastics. We don't have any conforming chemical composition of plastic products. So if you drink out of a plastic bottle, you don't necessarily have the same composition in the bottle that you're drinking out of as someone who's drinking another product. So tracking is great, but that's a data compilation that provides us information, but it doesn't target solving the problem. Fastest way to target solving the problem is to promote education on the adverse consequences of the use of the product, both from the environmental extraction, petroleum-based component, greenhouse gas emissions element, to the human consumption, the leaching into the human system, and the adverse health consequences that we already know and those that are still emerging: ADHD, endocrine disruption, fertility, cardiovascular disease, obesity, diabetes. These are all been tied to plastic use in terms of consumption or consumables. So these are the aspects, and then on top of it, the waste and the environmental degradation that occurs at the point of waste. So again, measurement is wonderful, but I think oftentimes as academics, we focus on looking at data collection rather than action. And at this point in time, we have the ability, the voice, and the knowledge to actually start to promote education for action. This is a great question from Mike. It's what is a policy intervention option for waste disposal that can be adopted by developing countries? I would say the first thing is to start to look at cradle to cradle production. Period. Developing countries have an opportunity because they don't have as much dependence fostered already on this type of a product where you actually are producing and disposing within the same country. So change the product systems to start looking at things that are much more focused on long-term use, not planned obsolescence, such as convenience-based consumption. Refocus back to cultural orientations where preservation of the environment may have been more greatly fostered. Get rid of that GDP focus of thinking that we need to grow that GDP value and think more about alternative measures of what make people in your country happy or give them a good life. Because that GDP measure is going to promote convenience consumption. Any convenience product is going to have a high resource footprint relative to its use life. So that's number one. If we are looking after the idea of selling more, selling more, selling more, the GDP model is the model that you're actually aligned to. But if you're looking at a quality of life, the GDP model doesn't necessarily trigger that unless you're able to handle the waste disposal. And right now, convenience-based consumption incorporates waste as an issue. On top of it, it has a huge ecosystem footprint in terms of the production itself. So let me move on to another comment here. All these questions are all related to waste. And I'm just going to reiterate, and I hope that this isn't reiterating it too much. We have to think beyond just that we have to live with the model of, or the framework of the economy that we have. Each one of us has an ability to start to change people's perceptions as to what makes them satisfied. Most people are not necessarily satisfied through accumulation-based models. So when we talk about waste, waste occurs because of a lack of conscious consumption, a lack of responsibility with regard to what we are consuming. We can be that change through the education, through a grassroots process, through the people that we interact with. By making that change significant enough, we change consumption patterns. Those consumption patterns, when they change, then affect the way the economy works. But then we also have the ability to vote. So we can vote people into office who understand consumption and understand the needs for it to change. So regulation in some respects can codify or reinforce that change. That's the only way that you can actually eliminate waste. Because if you try to do it from the market mechanism that we have right now, the goal will still be to maximize profit. And as long as the maximization of profit continues to exist, there's always going to be some new entry point. We're going to look at biodegradable single-use plastic, or we're going to look at some other element that looks good in terms of its environmental stance, but may not actually have the environmental integrity. It's still highly resource intensive. We fundamentally have to change how we look at consumption. And that is the only way that we can actually adjust the outward manifestations of waste accumulation and environmental degradation. So that would be my focus area. I wish I had a little bit more time to share some of that with you, but I know that we're going to be moving towards the end of our time period together. But I do hope that we can continue this discussion, because the number one thing that I believe and what I push in my organization is to change behavior. Behavioral change can change through taxation, which means that you tax people so they can't afford certain goods and services. But that's just a temporary salve, because you haven't changed inherently what they want. You have to be able to not only tax, but also educate people to understand why they're being taxed, that the underlying goal is to change their behavior. So from just the developed country perspective and the developing country perspective, the developed country perspective, we're so entrenched in one way of looking at models that it's difficult to change. But in the developing country perspective, it's an adoption of a model. So the model has an ability to change by changing the way that that model is integrated into the economy as a whole. Start to evaluate consumption differences between groups and socioeconomic levels of people. See who is adopting basically these high consumption levels because they have bought into the idea that psychologically that is equatable to happiness or success. Those are the elements that we actually have the ability to make some modifications with. I am so sorry, because I'm not as well versed with regard to looking at the chat box. So I have someone, what are the challenges to the effective enforcement of plastic ban regulation and the world at large? It all depends on the governmental structure. So the biggest challenge is what I've just mentioned over again a couple of times, unfortunately, which is the educational element. People have been duped into believing recycling works. That's number one. So, and number two, and I'd say this is especially true in the United States, is we've bought into this idea that we have a freedom, a right of consumption. So freedom to consume whatever is available in the store is how we operate. Freedom is not taught as a responsibility, and that's where I think we've missed the mark. So people don't necessarily think of freedom as a responsibility. They think of it as a right without responsibility or conveyance of the impact on others. So for plastic reduction, the number one thing that we have done in my organization is look at all the different multi-channels of communication using social media as well as traditional media to get our message out. The benefit that we have had in the last 2 years, as well as all of you, is that there's been a lot more information being written on plastic itself and the adverse consequences of it, as well as what's happening in the world in terms of plastic accumulation. So using this as a multi-pronged sword to really push this grassroots effort in terms of individuals seeing how their relationship with the planet affects their life and those of others is really, really important. Okay, I see a question here. Turning waste into economic value. We have waste littered all around the cities and nothing is being done to evacuate. Talk more of recycling these waste for economic and environmental sustainability. Okay, this is where I'm going to have a fundamental disconnect, because even though there is a lot of waste, and I do know this is true because we've exported in some cases, and we've exported the products in other cases, plastic waste in developing countries. The number one thing that has to be considered is recycling is not the solution for these products. Elimination of their use, but those products that currently exist, we need to find a safe way of disposing of them so they don't enter into the economic system, or excuse me, the environmental system through groundwater contamination or environmental contamination through killing of other animals and species. Right now, we know plastics are only photodegradable. They don't have a biodegradation component. Recycling actually increases emissions. And on top of it right now, given that the petroleum industry has very little growth potential and standard growth trajectories because of the desire to eliminate or reduce fossil fuel use in many areas, plastics has become a growth engine for the industry. So number one is we need to focus on not allowing that to happen. Number two, we need to gather that waste together and try to work on an effective elimination strategy, not one that requires or allows for that material to be downcycled and eventually enter our environment again through what I call waste diversion. So I hope that helps. In terms of technology, that would be an area where technology could actually benefit, not in terms of necessarily recycling to promote reuse of a product that we know is harmful, but to help us eliminate this product so we don't use it anymore, while we simultaneously engage in a process of eliminating convenience-based consumption. And again, remembering that convenience-based consumption exists primarily because it's a perfect conduit for GDP growth. So I hope I addressed that. Yes. Chinta has asked, is prevention of waste generation the most important? It definitely is. If we can start from the very beginning of production and assume and look to ensure that from the production point itself, we eliminate or promote zero waste, we're better off. The most important challenge that exists right now for waste management is current levels of consumption and the lack of understanding of the fact that every time you take one step away from the originating resource, you're actually becoming more resource intensive. So for example, my desire to have a cup of coffee as opposed to drinking a glass of water automatically creates resource use as well as resource waste, which is a waste management issue because of the skin of the coffee bean that has to be peeled and the potential toxicity of that if it's deposited in water, which affects water use and water drinkability in certain communities. Our understanding that everything is a luxury good and is even more of a luxury good the farther we are removed from the original source. So when I eat a salad, it has more ingredients in it. It has more resource intensive components to it than if I just had lettuce alone. These are the elements that we should be teaching in schools. And this is what would change the way that we have a relationship with both the environment and the waste that we create. Another simple factor, I don't eat animal flesh, but I know people do. We have commoditized animals, and animals, as you know, are one of the major reasons for greenhouse gas emissions, based especially in the United States, in terms of how we've commoditized them and the quality of life that we've given them. But when we look at this too, what we've also done is we've cheapened the price of their life. And this is what we've done with almost all life. So the market mechanism has allowed us to not only not see this as life, but it's allowed us to throw it away because we didn't pay that much for it. So we throw our relationship with food is a perfect example of another aspect of waste. And I'm going to tie this back to plastic for those of you that are still listening with regard to plastic. But our relationship with food, because it's so cheap in many countries, means that we throw food away without recognition of the fact that it's life that we've taken to keep our life, and then we've thrown it away without responsibility for that life that was taken. The additional aspect of that and that pricing is that we also obviously use convenience-based consumption items, single-use plastic, to eat a lot of food. So that's a compounding factor. And it's one that doesn't take into consideration the fact that convenience-based consumption now all of a sudden has eliminated the ability to really compost that food because you have commingled plastic waste. And a new product that's entering into this market is compostable plastic ware. And again, if you don't educate your public, they're just going to say, okay, well, this is compostable and I can take it with my food, which I don't value, and I throw it away. But now I can also throw away this compostable utensil and it won't matter because it's compostable. But again, we aren't changing the model when we don't educate. That compostable ware should be used only when it's absolutely necessary, because it's also highly resource intensive, right? You're creating and growing plant life to create these compostable food items, utensil items that will then only be used for one use and then be disposed of. So I will keep going back to the same route. If you want to make the change, we need to educate our public with regard to what that consumption choice that they're making currently has. And the impact here that's important to also consider is it's not just one single way of educating the public. Some people will care about the fact that life has been taken for their life. They will care about the value, the intrinsic value of the animal or the plant. Some people won't. Some people, they'll care about health and what's healthy for them, and how not disposing of things properly will affect their health. Some people won't care about that either. Some people will care about the well-being of their children. Some people care about the intergenerational impact that they leave. This is the area that we have failed in academics. We speak in a singular chain or a singular channel. We don't necessarily speak to how we can incentivize people of multiple or varying perspectives to align them to a common goal. In this case, the common goal is a sustainable perspective of how we look at our environment, and we try to eliminate waste creation. Or at least if we have waste, we have limited waste and it's biodegradable waste. So this is an area that I mentioned much earlier. It's what we'd call stakeholder engagement. And it's an area that I have focused on over the last year or two, more so than ever before. And it's because if we don't know how to channel our communication strategy among all the different constituents that we need to have aligned in order to make that cultural shift, we will fail at making that cultural shift at a time when there is urgency in that change. So that would be the argument that I would make there, is not only do we need education, but we need to speak to people in a way that they understand and that incentivizes their change, not in a way that we only understand. Yes, one person asks, is there a gap between developed and developing countries in practicing waste management? I'm going to say that that gap probably is in some cases a false gap, and in other cases probably exists. It depends on the country. And two things I want you to take into consideration. Incineration is not good waste management. It's just changing the composition to one of the three things that we need to live. Instead of having a solid form of the waste, you have tiny little fragments of waste and also gas that oftentimes is carcinogenic and has other adverse consequences to human and life itself. So that's not necessarily, in my opinion, waste management. And that incineration is one aspect of why certain countries don't have as much adverse consequence in terms of waste pileup. The other is that other countries have been able to export their waste for a long time, such as the United States. So we really don't know the integrity of our waste management process because we've never fully had to deal with it since we've exported so much. The issue I want to ask you is waste management, I just mentioned incineration. Majority of countries do what we also do in the US, which is landfill. We dig a hole and we put trash in it. And majority of the trash that we put in it is not biodegradable. So is that waste management? I would argue that in most cases, when you start to look at the holistic impact of waste management, I don't think any country does an excellent job of waste management because we aren't promoting cradle to cradle production from the very beginning. This is now something only now that we are trying to incorporate into our economic model. And again, the reason why it's difficult to incorporate is cradle to cradle basically undermines the very aspects of growth that our GDP modeling system, our GDP economic system is focused on. If you're looking at quick consumption items and planned obsolescence, GDP grows. When you're looking at cradle to cradle, there's probably less opportunity for as much growth as there would be in terms of a convenience-based or gratification-based model. So again, in order to really get to where we want to go, we have to think holistically. So it's education, but also the education understanding that that slide is now starting to change our cultural orientation with the environment, and our understanding of the impact of waste will effectively impact also how we're going to measure our economy and our health. So focusing on the economic framework is extremely important right now. We cannot do this without that. We have to be able to accept a change in how we measure. Sarder has asked if we can develop an alternative product to plastic. I'm going to take one step back because number one, I would like us to think that this product only has been around for 40 years, approximately 40 years. We had an economy, we had systems, we had humans living without this product for a long period of time before. So the question we have to ask, I think, is to start to evaluate this product's development and its holistic impact on us. And if we actually do need an alternative product, or this is a great sign or signal for us to turn back to maybe a more simple use of products and products that were actually biodegradable. And that's what I would actually advocate more so for that. Let's think about why these types of products are created. They're created for speed to market with the idea of trying to make profit quickly. They were not vetted for all the potential adverse impacts. That's why anti-litter programs and recycling came after the fact. They didn't come with these products. So I really more than anything hope that if there's something to take away and that you'll think about after our discussion today is whether or not this model that we're operating under works in a way that we should try to substitute, or is it something that now we should just recognize the 70 years that we have been operating with the GDP framework, we have increased the speed of climate change because it's the same 70 years that the UNFCCC has noted that climate change has taken off. In the last 40 years, we've had basically a normalization of many diseases from endocrine disruption, fertility, ADHD, obesity. And we know that this product is tied to those elements in terms of human health. So is there a reason for us to be looking at substitutes, or is there a reason for us to start thinking holistically and see where this model, this gratification-based model, may be part of the problem, and maybe we need to change so that we can have a model that actually incorporates some aspect of moral responsibility towards one another and defines freedom as a responsibility as well. So that would be what I would suggest. I appreciate that comment very much. I'm going to go to one more question and see if there are any other items outside of this. Yes, even in the US, we have a problem with elimination of municipal waste. It's not just a developing country problem. The issue has become so big for us because we have, specifically with plastic, that we are starting to look at incineration as another option, which I just brought up to you. So if in the short run that is the option we take, the issue becomes measuring. If we're going to collect data, this is where I would suggest you start to collect data, start to measure the incidence of health-related issues for people who live in the immediate vicinity or downwind from incineration plants, as being a means of justifying a change in the type of production and the type of vetting of new products before they're brought to market. Products should be able to be burned without adverse consequences to the atmosphere and to human and environmental health. So right now we're in a conundrum. We have on a global scale a lot of waste. We have on a global scale a lot of waste that's actually toxic to life. The area that I think we should be focusing on is how to eliminate it permanently. So stop producing it on one hand, but then also look at technological progress in terms of safe elimination of this. But that safe elimination is not just related to what we currently have, but it's also about what we've buried, what exists in our oceans, and all of these other waste areas that we have to contend with that will adversely affect us for decades to come. So perhaps maybe that's a GDP growth component, a cleanup of waste. We could perhaps do that on one hand while we actually change the cultural orientation of how we look at economic growth on the other. The biodegradation of waste, there are two. In terms of waste in cities, the one area that we looked at specifically is food. Food is the easiest to look at in terms of commercial composting. It only takes about an acre of land for a city of maybe 100,000 people, maybe 2 acres of land. You have to have the appropriate capital, of course, to turn the piles, but it's an easy way to actually take food and recompost it in terms of use again within 3 months for planting. So you could then have community gardens in an urban or semi-urban environment. The use of or the elimination of single-use plastics is coincident with this food composting, because most people, when they dispose of their food, if they haven't completed eating it, dispose of it usually with the paper plates and the plastic forks, knives, and spoons they may have been using. If all of those were commercially compostable, then when the food is taken, it can actually be turned into compost relatively quickly. So through food waste, to answer one question that came up, can be easily done by eliminating single-use plastic and because single-use plastic cannot be commingled with food waste, and then it's contaminated. You can't take care of either one. And you don't want your compost to be commingled with plastic, because then you have the potential for leaching of that single-use plastic as you're using it for other processes. So this one's coming from Hoda. Do you think supporting composting or recycling may itself encourage people to make more waste, as recycling or composting plants are providing job opportunities? Definitely. Composting actually is not a bad thing, but it should go in tandem with the reduction of food waste itself. So some examples are such as Korea, where they've instituted a weight. So your food is weighed as you're throwing it away. So you're charged. The goal is to disincentivize people from throwing away food waste. So I think, again, you have to have an educational platform about not wasting food. And then on top of it, you have to eliminate the amount or gross poundage of food that's being thrown away. Obviously, coupling it with compostables, and if you're still using convenience products, is important, but you don't want that to be your growth engine, because then what ends up happening is that you make waste a continued part of your culture. And again, with recycling, on some, I've spent time talking about plastic, but there are other products such as aluminum that can be recycled. That, of course, is a positive, because it's a closed loop system, can be made into a similar product. What you can do with glass, instead of promoting recycling, which then means you have to crush and remanufacture, why don't we go back? And this, I'm speaking very unfortunately from a US-centric perspective, but in the US, we no longer have products such as Coca-Cola bottles that you buy from the grocery store and you take them back, and then the company comes and picks them up and is responsible to clean them and then repackage them and remarket them. We don't have that anymore. So the glass gets all disposed in one big bin, which is very inefficient, because it ends up typically being used for alternative purposes like roadway creation or kitchen counters, as opposed to being used again for the same purpose that it was created for. So that means you're endlessly creating more and more of the original product. So I think we need to step back and see what type of sustainable employment we want to have. Do we want employment that's based on a product that really does not align itself to sustainability? So then we end up being beholden to the fact that we're going to make people unemployed if we switch away from it. So we are going through a period of massive change. The smartest thing we can do is stop looking incrementally at making small changes that we're eventually going to have to correct again, and just go after making big changes. Let's eliminate products that we know cannot be recycled. Let's focus on the things that can efficiently be recycled. Instead of recycling bottles, let's have the manufacturers pick up those bottles, or at least standardize bottles, so the only thing that differentiates one product from another is the label. Let's start to do things that are more efficient with the resources we have available and use them over and over again, reuse. Give value to people, not because of how much they have, but how thrifty they are. If we value people for their thrift, that would be a cultural variation that would give people a sense of status for being thrifty and being steward-minded. See the cultural transformation that we need to make, as opposed to trying to make the transformation of how we look at the environment within the economic system that we have. They are mutually inconsistent. The economic system that we have does not take into consideration a moral or stewardship agenda, and only allocates value to market costs. in order to have the justice that we need over here in terms of sustainability, we need to redefine how we look at operating within our societies. So that would be my comment there. I'll look at one more question here. Compost, actually, this is a great question from Mohammed. Compost, the way that our facilities operate is you drop off your food waste at a station in your community. That is then picked up and it's composted right away. It's put in a stack with other carbon materials, so wood chips and other tree and organic debris. So the temperature rises typically around 140 degrees, and that helps it break down. And then has to be turned and shredded. So that's the capital investment that you need. But also if that turning and shredding occurs when people are at least gauging what the weather patterns are, the wind specifically, so they can make sure that it's not smelly, that's really important. So the turn of compost, a food compost, can happen within 3 months. I'm trying to see if there are some other. This is a great question from Belur. How do you compare and optimize design for efficiency, reliability, and safety to design for waste minimization? I'm going to offer this suggestion, and this may not be what you had anticipated, but this is related to our limitation of knowledge. So we know a little bit as humans with regard to our relationship with the environment, but we don't know enough. We're always learning more. Today, how we look and interact with the environment is very different than we did 30 years ago. Arguably, perhaps maybe a few thousand years ago, we probably were more intelligent because we understood our complete dependence upon the environment. But what I would suggest is, this is also part of that cultural transformation or framework change that I shared earlier, is right now we live in a system where we do something, we put an operation or a process in place, and then we check the box. We don't necessarily go back and reevaluate it to ensure that it's meeting the intention, or as new information comes around, that we incorporate that into making sure we're creating greater efficiency. And we don't necessarily always define what we're trying to meet as a goal. So when we're looking at waste minimization schemes, I think we have to fundamentally define what we're meeting as a goal. What is it that we want in terms of waste minimization? Otherwise, you're just making an iterative approach time after time with a small reduction in waste. I would think that most societies, when they're looking at waste minimization, are looking at it in terms of a quality of life component, a mission for quality of life. If waste minimization is tied to that, then you have a strategy in place, because now anything that you put in place has to tie to that overarching strategy for that society. So that's number one. And honestly, there are not very many communities that actually have these types of mission statements, what I call a social mission statement, in terms of the objective that they're trying to meet for their people. GDP, unfortunately, has become the primary social mission statement for most countries, most communities, most peoples, without even their recognition of it. But if you have one that deals with more qualitative elements, then when we're looking at waste minimization, now you have something you have to tie that waste minimization strategy to, but you have to do what's called a process map. You look at each step of that process of waste minimization. You evaluate it consistently. You basically employ what we call risk management. We look routinely to see if we are meeting the mandate of the desired risk reduction relative to the societal mission, rather than just an iterative approach. The other thing I mentioned very early on in our conversation is we oftentimes are looking for solutions, and quick solutions cannot exist for problems such as the problems that we have, except for cessation of use. That's a quick solution that can exist. But with regard to the actual elimination of waste, we need to also recondition people with regard to their relationship with the waste creation and the environmental degradation that's related to their consumption. It is a longer term process than a few years. What you can do in a few years through regulation may create some significant change, but unless you've actually changed the way that people inherently perceive their relationship with the environment and their goals with regard to how they're going to orient their life, is there a concept of progress based on accumulation, or is there concept of the value of their life based on something else? You cannot fundamentally change the system in the way that it needs to be changed, which is that cultural shift. So that's where I would leave our conversation, is that we need to look at a fundamental cultural shift, which means that we cannot look at a quick fix. We cannot look at eliminating plastic use on one hand to substitute with a biodegradable product that does the same thing on the other. We actually have to take into consideration that we're going to have to be inconvenienced in this shift, in this cultural shift, to live without what we thought that we had a right to have, because what we thought we had a right to have was at a cost that's too high for the environment to bear, and also too high a cost for most of us to bear in terms of our own health and well-being. So nothing I've said actually offers a quick solution, but I do think what it does offer is an opportunity to think about what types of long-term educational paradigm shifting solutions you're willing to put in place, whether you're willing to take your gratification from the perspective of putting a change in place that you may not necessarily be the beneficiary of. If you're willing to go back to an earlier time, just like a few decades ago, where we all know this, regardless of what culture we're from, our parents or grandparents or great-grandparents put things into play, not necessarily because they were going to gain from it, but because they knew that some future society would. That mandate, that way of looking at life and feeling the purpose and value of our existence is a cultural shift as well. But that is what's missing in today's world when we're looking at self-gratification, quick and easy salves, and the maintenance of our own personal interests. We can't do that because we are interconnected and our freedoms impinge on other freedoms of other people. So with that, I'm going to, perhaps if that's okay, hopefully I have a chance to hand it back to our nice hosts, and we can conclude our discussion. Are there any comments that I can take from, or I can shift to our Isanka? Thank you. Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, yes. Thank you very much, Dr. Madhavi. So I think you have shared a lot of things with us because we have looked about the Q&A box. It's coming a lot of questions to us. I think with the limited time, we were able to, especially Dr. Madhavi, were able to answer to a lot of questions which you have sent. But if we miss anything, so please apologize for us, because some of you have sent kind of similar questions also. So I think I have, when you have looked about the Q&A, so most of people have congrats, as well as some of have shared this our live streaming. Then I think that it will really help to your students or your colleagues. Then they may able to get a lot of information through this session. And after this session, definitely we will share our recordings. As well as if you have visited TIICAM Facebook fan page, you may able to get all this series, because it will be on throughout. Then you can share it among your societies, among your associations, or with your students or with your colleagues. So that will be the really easy way to share this knowledge with this technology. So it's part of a good side of this technology. Because of this technology, today we are connected with around today we had about 75 active participation till now. There were more people earlier. Then I hope all of you will join with our future events as well, which we are planning to organize in with our association, as well as related to our other conferences. I just getting the time to mention about those things, especially we organize this Zoom event powered by the Association for Environment Management and Sustainability. Then we are planning to organize different type of forums in future. When if you can join with us for our 4th International Conference on Economics and Development 2020. It will be held on 3rd and 4th in December virtually. Then 5th International Conference on Climate Change 2021. It will be held on 18 and 19 February, as well as the 2nd World Conference on Waste Management 2021 will be held on 4th and 5th March 2021. Then again, thank you very much, Dr. Madhavi, for joining with us today, because we know it's early morning to you, as well as we have struggled to make this happen, and you guided us, because we are working together quite a long time period. So thanks a lot for sharing this thing, because especially when our security contacting you to further discuss about these things. So you have tremendous support to us by sharing a lot of things. That's the important thing, because some are really new, as well as I would like to congratulate for the project. I think it's really successful. I hope not only that area, you may able to go to some of other countries as well to do it. I hope everything will be a success, because end of the day it will come to this planet for the betterment of the planet. As well as I would like to wish for your new book. We will be waiting to till it's publishing. And yeah, so if you have anything, all our participants, if you have anything to clarify or anything, you have our details, please contact us. As well as you are in our database right now, so we will send all the information related to this field. If we have any other future events, then definitely we will let you know. I hope as a network, this is the easy way to share our knowledge without considering about borders, because in this pandemic situation. As well as I hope all of you will be stay safe and work hard. And to the final note, I would like to add to all of you, because qualifying the like-minded people who are joining with us today. So all of us want to do some change in this world to make a better world. So don't wait till anyone is starting anything, any government or any organization is start anything. We can do that change. We can start from our side. So real example is Dr. Madhavi. So if you can do a tiny thing to betterment of the world, so it may have a bigger impact in some part of the world. So keep in mind, a tiny change, a tiny step to change this world will make a better impact. So don't wait till tomorrow. So you can start it from today's self. So with that note, thank you very much, Dr. Madhavi, and all participants join with us today from different part of the world. And at the end, again, I'd like to give greetings, Sri Lankan traditional greetings. It's called Aiboan. Thanks a lot. Hope to see you again in another day.
Bye.
Bye, Dr.